Jeff Downs, you are the first guest on the Future of Thought podcast. How does that feel?
I'm very thankful to be here, Colton. Appreciate it. It feels good. Feels good.
Means a lot. It means a lot. It's good to have someone like you around to talk to you, especially during this time. I mean, we are in a pandemic, a potential dangerous transfer of power, many people would say, politically. I mean, what is going on right now, Jeff? Can you explain anything, like why people aren't trusting Dr. Fauci and they're trusting Trump? Like, what's going on right now?
Yeah. So just a little bit of background on myself. I'm in no way an expert on these things. I'm merely just a student, though I'm a student in psychology at Creighton University. And I'm planning to go into grad school for clinical psychology. But I have learned a little bit and done a little bit of research on some topics that might kind of have a little bit of correlation with this. Though, of course, everyone's psychology is different. That's kind of the beauty of psychology. So take take what you will from this, but also take it with a grain of salt. But essentially, there's kind of this idea of authority figures, and one of the probably most famous, or one of the most famous, I should say, experiments that were done on this topic of authority was the Milgram Studies of the 1960s and 70s. And I don't know, Colton, are you familiar with those at all?
Actually, I'm a little bit familiar. I've taken some political psychology in the past, but explain for those who don't know, and just to give me a better understanding, what were those studies?
Yeah, so essentially the Milgram Studies was a study about conformity to authority. And what Milgram did was he had people come into the lab, and he basically had it set up to where everyone but one person was in on it, which is what we refer to as research confederates. Um, and so essentially they would be told that this was an experiment on different learning styles, and that people might respond better to punishment when it comes to learning. That was the cover story for this anyway. So uh, the subject, or the participant, was there with another research confederate, and they pulled out like a note card basically on whether they would be the learner, which would be the questions would be asked them, or the teacher, who would be giving the questions, and the teacher would administer shock for each wrong answer, and the shock would increase as the main researcher, the private investigator, would see fit. So essentially, they, right before they went in, the Confederate told the participant that, hey, by the way, I have a heart condition, so if we need to stop, I might need to stop in the middle of this. So they would go, he would intentionally get questions wrong, and they would believe that they were administering shock. The teachers, in this case, being the participant, would be administering the shock, which is not really a shock. But they would, play a recording of, depending on the severity of the shock, it could range from, oh, ow, that hurts, ow, to like screaming and, oh my God, let me out. And each time the participant kind of expressed dismay with this, was, the investigator, the researcher, would basically, all that they would say would be, the research requires that you continue. And that was enough. That was enough for them to keep going up to what was labeled as a potentially deadly shock. And, the subject, or the Confederate, would be saying, oh, like my heart, I need to get out of here right now. And then at the end, after each shock, they would just not say anything. And so, leading to believe that this person's dead. And almost every single person went all the way up to the highest shock. They would kind of interchange different variables to see like what worked best, and like persuading the person from not continuing. And what they found was actually if they had two other teachers with them, which were also Confederates in this case, if they decided halfway through, hey, this is bad, I'm going to quit now, that would essentially help the other person to kind of gain up the courage to be like, yeah, no, this is bad, because no one in these experiments was liking the fact that they were shocking or thought that they were shocking someone. They just went along with it because they thought that that's what they had to do. And so with these two dissenting teachers who they thought were other participants, whenever they say, hey, no, we're going to quit, that they're able to conform to that group instead. And another variable that was not quite as significant, but still was significant, was another dissenting authority figure. So like, let's say that if there was another researcher in the building with them that said, hey, like, we should stop this right now, and the other experimenter was saying, no, let's continue. That was another way of kind of figuring this out.
So that sounds, sorry to cut you off, but that sounds a lot like politics today. It sounds like, oh, let's listen to Trump over Dr. Fauci because he's that presidential figure, right? But I wonder, off of what you just said most recently, how do you think, why do you think people aren't responding in the same way to that other authority figure? Trump is the president, but Dr. Fauci is, let's just say, a very knowledgeable physician.
Yeah, definitely. So it's hard to say. You could say that it's what we call the sleeper effect, which is basically that over time, let's say, and a good example of this is like political ads. So in political ads, you see like, the message that's attacking the other candidate, they eat babies, or they hate veterans or whatever, let's say. And so that's going to, initially, the people who are watching that ad are going to be like, oh my God, this is awful. This is an awful person. And then they see at the end, oh, paid for by X candidate who's like running against them. So they're going to say, oh, well, this is obviously biased. Maybe their credibility isn't too high. But what tends to happen over time is that after they figure out the credibility of the source, what tends to happen is that people tend to revert to the original idea just over time, because the like source and the message over time tend to get dissociated from each other. And so then people are just left with the original message. And so that's how like political ads are pretty effective in that sense. And so that doesn't necessarily explain specifically how like Trump and Fauci like are kind of dueling on this sort of like, or people perceive that they're dueling on this. But I think that what kind of comes into play here is misinformation on different social medias, such as like, you have like your QAnon or your Project Veritas, which are, I don't know, are you familiar with any of those called QAnon or Project Veritas?
I do know QAnon. I don't know enough about them, but in all honesty, I've read enough to know I don't really want to know more. And maybe that's saying more about me than it is about them. But misinformation certainly is a problem today.
Yeah, no, it definitely is. And there's other sources. I just tend to point out these two because they're kind of the front runners and what people are thinking about today. And specifically with Project Veritas, they kind of like to go with these kind of gotcha videos where they a lot of times will pay people to act like, well, let's say in the case of like voter fraud this year during this election, they often would like pay people to say, oh, well, I'm burning these ballots, I work for the USPS, this kind of stuff. And it wasn't true, but they kind of used it as kind of a gotcha moment in that case. And so if people see that and they're like, oh my God, this is awful, there's obviously something going on. And then later they figure out, oh, well, apparently this wasn't a very credible source. Later on down the line, they're going to remember the message, but they're not going to remember the source. So that could be kind of a part of the whole like mass anti-masking thing, and just COVID denying, where you see misinformation on Facebook or what have you, and you figure out later, well, not too much of a credible source if you get that far, and then later on you forget that source wasn't credible, or you forget where the message came from specifically. You don't remember where you saw it, you just remember that you saw it. So that's kind of a lot of what happens, in my opinion.
Part of me wonders if you can blame people as much as they're blamed. And it sounds a little bit counterintuitive to say, oh, you can't blame QAnon followers for believing in QAnon. But looking at social media, or the Social Dilemma docudrama that just came out, talking about how you live in this echo chamber, this bubble of Facebook posts, of artificial intelligence determining what you look at. Is there no validity in the idea that people who are seeing their extreme pushed more extreme, more divisive, either right or left or otherwise, that they are not entirely to blame for this misinformation? Because now you have so many sources. Let's say you have 1,000 people you follow on Twitter, and you saw a tweet one day. You thought, oh, that's fact, but you don't have a clue where it came from. Is the burden entirely on that individual following the tweets or on Facebook? Or is there some blame in the algorithms or even in the corporations, if you want to take it that far?
Well, yeah, no, I completely see where you're coming from there. And yeah, I'd say a lot of it does kind of have to do with the algorithms and what's being pushed out there, and the sources themselves. I wouldn't blame the people who are believing in these, because, I think that's counterintuitive. You can't, if someone believes it's fact, then like that's where they're coming from, and that's just what they're seeing. And so if their algorithm, or if the things that they're following are only showing them their side, then that kind of entrenches them in their views. And that's also an idea of kind of like, if you let's say someone who's kind of a little bit less educated on a specific issue, and I don't mean to say that they're not educated, I just mean that they don't really know about a particular issue as much, then the best mode of persuasion is a one-sided argument. So let's say, what's something you don't know about?
There's a lot of things. Astrophysics is something.
Astrophysics, yeah. I know absolutely nothing about astrophysics either, but I could say, let's say you know nothing about the sun, or in Earth's orbit or anything. If you're not educated on that, then I could tell you, the sun revolves around the Earth, let's say. So in that case, if I wanted to persuade you to that position, I would only give you my side of the argument. You only want a one-sided argument when it comes to things that people are a little bit less informed about. So, for example, no one's really informed about COVID, considering it's new. But there are people who know about disease prevention. But the people who are believing in, oh, COVID is false, masks don't work, that kind of stuff, most of the time, I won't say all of the time because you don't want to speak in absolutes, but most of the time, there are people who aren't really educated on disease prevention, or what have you. And so if you want to present them with the idea that, oh, masks don't work, masks are against your freedom, or COVID is just a fallacy, it doesn't really exist, or whatever other information is going out there, misinformation. If you present them with a one-sided argument, they're more likely to be persuaded to that side because they don't get to hear the other side, if that makes sense.
So you're basically saying don't validate the counter argument, or don't validate, like, you don't want to approach it as saying, I understand where you're coming from. Here's why those points aren't exactly right. You say it's probably better to simply absolutely say, actually, you're incorrect. Here's all the reasons why. And then don't acknowledge what they're saying.
Well, no, not entirely. So that's actually a different thing. So what I'm saying is that if someone is completely like they don't know anything, they have no position on an issue, then you'd want to present a one-sided argument. But if they did have a position like, hey, I think masks work, I believe that COVID is a problem, if you wanted to persuade them, it's a little bit harder, but then you would want to present that counter argument. You want to use that two-sided argument, and say, I understand where you're coming from, this point, but here are my counterpoints. If that, like, you get where I'm coming from?
Yeah, that makes sense. That's an important distinction. It makes me wonder then, from your opinion or from anything you've read or looked into or researched, uh, how important do you think it is that we are knowledgeable about these topics? You hear these arguments that meritocracy might be best because during a pandemic, you should only listen to those who know about viruses or epidemiology. But at the same time, that infringes on some liberties, as you and I are both American citizens. So I wonder, you don't have to take this politically if you don't want to, but what is the value in listening to those who really understand what they're talking about? Or is it not really that important and you just think it'd be better for people morally?
Well, I think it's very important to listen to experts, obviously, in my opinion. Um, However, you also need to listen, you need to kind of do your own research as well, and specifically on the expert who is saying these things as well. I'm not saying just blindly follow and, you know, be sheeple, as people like to say, or whatever. But what I'm saying is that you need to really, really look at who the person is and why they should be considered an expert, and look at their message, look at what they're saying, and see if what they're saying has any merit or has any truth to it. So in the case of like Dr. Fauci, he is an expert because he has been the country's leading communicable disease expert since the AIDS crisis. He's been around for ages and ages. And, obviously I think that gives him a little bit of credit there, a little bit of expertise. And what he's saying is very much in line with the scientific thought that, masks are used to help prevent the spread of disease. You see it in surgeon rooms, you see it in doctor's offices, any medical place, especially if you're operating on, like, say, open wounds. You don't want to breathe any bacteria into those wounds and whatnot. There's also been studies on, a lot of the argument comes from, well, if you wear a mask, you can't breathe because it decreases your CO or your oxygen levels, increases CO2 levels. And there's a lot of research out there that kind of deems that to be false. And that kind of also goes along with, you see this expert and you can say, he's an expert, sure, but also his message is very in line with what we're thinking. Whereas, like, I forget the name of the new guy, but I believe President Trump has also appointed like a new doctor who's kind of a little more in tune with his thinking with, oh, we don't need masks or whatever. I don't know exactly what his position is, but he appointed him. But if you look at his expertise, he is a doctor. So you would automatically think that he'd be an expert, but he's a radiologist. I believe. And, like, what does radiology have to do with disease control, pandemic control? Really nothing. So you kind of need to distinguish the expertise of each science in that case.
Is there a middle ground to be had? It sounds like you're presenting that we should trust experts, and I agree with that thought. I'm sure most people do, although I'm sure there's a larger number than we would like to accept that don't. But is there a middle ground to be had? Is there a ultimate centrism that's just, if you meet in the middle between those who say anti-mask and mask, that's all right. That's the best we get because human psychology says you're not going to convince people all the way. So let's just meet in the middle.
Um, Safely, that's a good question. Honestly, it's tough because, I mean, yeah, you always want to try and kind of meet in the middle and find some common ground. But at the same time, you also want to keep people safe. And if the other side of the ground is just completely unsafe, then you don't want to go that far. But I think you can find some sort of a middle ground with masks and whatnot. And I think people have tried to do that. For example, very early on in the pandemic, there was shutdowns. People didn't like those shutdowns, and people were, storming state capitals to reopen and plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan or whatever. So obviously, some sort of middle ground needed to be found there, and I think the middle ground there was to, you know, in public you wear masks. We can reopen our economy. We can reopen our businesses slowly and safely. And I think that was the middle ground that we found in that case. In regards to the masks, I mean, you could say, wear a mask in all cases where you can't social distance. And I mean, even that is a little unsafe because the 6 feet of distance is kind of an arbitrary number. Kind of depends on the conditions. Like, say if there's a bunch of wind outside, or if it's like really humid outside, I believe it travels even farther. So the six feet of distance is kind of a guideline for that. It's kind of more arbitrary and just like a general rule.
So Jeff, it sounds like you're saying, from your perspective, middle grounds are good. Let's say in terms of policy or not starting, civil warfare at the one extreme. But it also sounds like you're saying middle grounds are malleable, and maybe that's intuitive. Let's look at anti-vax. That is something I would argue the middle ground shouldn't be had. You either vaccinate children who can receive it for those diseases that require herd immunity, or you don't. So do you parallel that line of thinking that some things, there is a danger in having a centrism? Let's go most extreme, slavery. Obviously, that's not recent, but you could say, oh, let's just meet in the middle or right around 3/5. Well, that's surely a compromise, as we all are well aware, but it's actually not moral in the human sense. So what do you think about the malleability of centrism?
Yeah. So it seems like a lot of issues that are presented in kind of polarized terms, left, right, black or white issue, whatever have you. And so a lot of these issues do have a middle, but once you meet in the middle, then people are going to diverge from that middle in one way or another. And so then the position that's now in the middle becomes the position on the one side. And so that becomes the one spectrum. And then it kind of pushes forward to another degree. And shoot, I'm trying to think of there's a phenomenon for this where, the more, like, say on the political spectrum, let's say like Social Security or something, I'm sure that was controversial at the time of its passing. And then whenever it did get passed, that kind of became the norm, and people aren't going to touch it anymore as much. So people aren't going to completely want to get rid of it, but people also might want to expand on it, or, but they don't want to completely get rid of it anymore because that's just too extreme now. But at one point that wasn't an extreme. That was just a position you could take.
It makes you wonder, and I know you're not a philosopher or anything like that, but it does make you wonder, is this ability to be a centrist or even just to have proper opinions, the right approach psychologically to what's best for our country or for the world or beyond if we go to other planets, is that really just a moral question? Do you think, oh, as time progresses, we have to do what's morally in our best interest? And as every country has a different set of morals, they psychologically will approach things differently. And in the future, we may say certain policy we have now is unacceptable, and we may say certain policy has lasted generations. Or do you think it's really this overarching, more of an objective truth that we just haven't approached yet?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if I could answer it very accurately, but I mean, I can certainly attempt to. Um, but yeah, I mean, I believe that like being a centrist, I consider myself to be more center leaning. I'd say center left leaning, but everyone is a centrist in some form or another. Um, no one 100% completely agrees with certain ideologies or what have you. You know, for example, you could even make the argument, and I'm sure this is going to be controversial, and I don't necessarily believe it. You can make the like the argument that Trump is a centrist because he doesn't necessarily align with every single belief of the Republican Party or the conservative values, you know, such as say like same-sex marriage. He really doesn't have any backlash on that. And his other positions on sexuality and stuff, that's up to a different question. But in terms of same-sex marriage, you know, he's okay with it. He doesn't care. And that's, again, that might be kind of that idea that, you know, now our country's values have kind of changed and shifted since that Supreme Court decision, and people are a little more accepting of it, and a little more likely to believe that is, you know, like a little more acceptable. They're less likely to try and overturn it unless they're, you know, very religiously conservative and believe that it shouldn't be. But you know, anyone try and go after and overturn that, like they have in cases like, you know, Roe v. Wade or something. That's kind of been their big the big deal of trying to overturn that rather than something like gay marriage. And I think that is kind of a byproduct of shifting values of the country.
I wonder if the two-party system we have today, which you hear almost cliche that it's a problem, Republicans farther right, Democrats farther left, at least on the edges, and then of course media in the U.S. driven by economics, you know, wants to feed that base. It makes you wonder, are we ever going to reach a point, if we haven't already, where this movable centrism or this movable place of unity is no longer attainable or will no longer be attainable? And if you have any insight on the psychology of why we like parties so much, or in grouping and out grouping, I would love to hear you expand on that more, and then maybe give your insight on, are we really out of luck? Are we not able to agree anymore? Is there a path forward?
Yeah. I'll address your first question first and the second question second. So in regards to, is there a path forward to not necessarily centrism, but like, you know, collaboration between the parties, a little bit less of a polarization? I believe there is. The thing is that we've been through this before as a country. You know, the Civil War was probably the most divisive time. Literally, the country divided itself into two different countries. And again, that was on one particular issue that they took. Some people were very anti-slavery, some people were very pro-slavery, and that's probably the most divided the country has been ever. I mean, there's been a lot of verbal attacks recently, which, I mean, it's not really extremely new for politics in this country, but we haven't seen anything like in the Civil War with, oh, I forget who it was. There was a senator who damn near almost beat to death another senator with his cane, like in the Senate hall. We haven't really reached that point yet. Will we? I sure hope not. But I believe that's, if we can come back from that, we can probably come back from where we are currently if we start taking the proper steps. So in regards to, why we prefer to align with a certain political party and whatnot, or certain in-groups and out-groups, really, I think people choose their party based on their values and what ones align most with what party. In some cases, and some cases it might be something different, might be just the way they're raised or what have you. And I guess that kind of goes along with values as well. But if you truly believe that a certain political party is, right or correct, then you're going to want to kind of conform to that group a little bit more, to be really accepted. And I think you see that in a lot of politicians, a lot of it, people say, oh, they're changing their position to be, reelected. And I'm sure that's true in some cases as well, but I'm sure it's also a bit of a conformity issue where people are wanting to be accepted by that particular group, and really wanting to be, a face in it or be front runner. So that's why I think a lot of people will align themselves with the president, whether they agree with everything he says or not. It kind of depends on the person, how they feel about like establishment politics and all that. And it's different. And there's a lot of people even who, they like, probably most of the like pretty far right groups, I mean, they're all about, oh, don't conform, don't be sheep. But it's actually kind of a little bit ironic because in that case they are conforming. They're conforming to a different group, but they're still conforming. It's impossible to not be a conformist in some way, unless you are going to be a hermit that lives naked in a cave or something. Like there's not really, you're going to be conforming to one norm or another, in some way. But in terms of like the polarization aspect of it, I think a good comparison would be with like, or I guess it's not really a good comparison, but you can compare it to say like race or sexuality or sexual orientation, how people are often, victims of discrimination or prejudice. So there's kind of 3 steps that are displaying the psychology of this, which are stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. Those are kind of the 3 factors that kind of compound on this issue, which a stereotype is essentially just a belief that you associate a certain trait with a certain group. So in the case of politics, Democrats, you'd say the stereotype is that they're all left-leaning, or I guess not, obviously they're left-leaning, but like, oh, they're all communists, or they're all snowflakes. And in the Republican Party, you'd say they're all fascists or racists or whatever is being thrown out as the stereotype. And the prejudice is the hostile or negative feelings toward the group based only on that membership of the group. So I don't like the Republican Party, or I don't like Democrat Party, they're ruining our lives. Discrimination would be the negative behavior directed towards the people in the group. So, saying unkind words to each other, or going out in the press and attacking people, or in the most severe cases, violence. Those are kind of the three aspects that you can kind of apply to this kind of idea. And so there's also a few other camps of beliefs. There's the social categorization theory, which is basically, it kind of goes along with this, where if you separate people into groups, it leads to overgeneralizations. It leads to those stereotypes. So again, you kind of tend to overestimate how similar the outgroup is and overestimate the differences between the two groups. And you are more likely to view the members in your in-group as more varied. Like, they're all different, they all have different beliefs. Whereas, that out-group, they all think the same, they all do the same things, they're all terrible people or whatever. So it kind of comes from a lack of contact and kind of a lack of a mental effort to try to individualize the other people there. And I think we see that a lot, especially on like social medias, Twitters, Facebook, whatever. You kind of take a heuristic there where you want to like just generalize, oh, the Democrats are evil or the Republicans are coming to get you. But really, there's a lot of variability there, and it's kind of interesting stuff.
So that would make sense. I can even see myself doing that as someone who, it sounds like yourself, is relatively centrist, although not absolutely on every issue. I paint this brush, and even in the questions I've asked you today, you can see that I paint this brush of, Republicans or conservatives are far right, or Democrats are far left. And I do wonder, you know this better than me, certainly, is it not the case that Republicans are getting farther right and Democrats are getting farther left? Or is that even something of a myth, or, as you alluded to earlier, not even close to as important as it was in the Civil War?
Well, the thing is that if you're going to take it on a psychology level, it definitely appears that way, and there's a lot of individuals in the Democrat or Republican Party who are farther to the right or farther to the left, but there's a lot of people in the center who they don't really get talked about because it's not news. They're not controversial figures. So there's a difference between like a Bernie Sanders and I can't even name a particular politician that's to the center. Maybe like a Doug Jones. I believe I have to make sure I'm right on this. Doug Jones, who is also a Democrat, I believe. But he's a lot more centrist than like a Bernie Sanders. And I guess he's not technically part of the Democratic Party until he runs for president, but Kamala Harris or AOC, let's say, there's a difference between those two Democrats, and there's a difference between like a Jim Imhoff or a I guess like even like a John McCain. He was pretty conservative. He was very well conservative. But he voted on things, such as he voted for Obamacare, he voted for the Affordable Care Act. And so I think, again, this saying, the left and the right are getting more and more farther apart, I think to an extent, yes, but it also kind of depends on an individual level, which, again, I'm not a psychologist, but I'm studying psychology, which is, again, an individualistic approach to studying the mind, whereas maybe a sociologist would be a little more apt to study that because they study more in the case of like groups and stuff.
Well, it makes you wonder then. It seems to be clear, at least on the left, as it's often called, that there is a stronger sense of identity attached to your beliefs. Identity politics, as it's commonly called. That your ability to have an abortion is part of your identity. Your gender is part of your identity. It's a facet of you personally and internally. And it seems that there is something of a counter-reactionary measure similar on the right as well. So would it be fair to say that maybe it's not getting farther right or farther left, but people are getting a stronger attachment to those identities, to those beliefs that they hold?
Yeah, actually, I think you hit the nail right on the head there. I do believe that people are just more convicted in their views. They're a little bit less likely to, come across the aisle, as they say, and work together on these things. And a lot of it, I think, does happen to be from, the individuals who are farther on the left or farther on the right, who are, kind of pushing back very strongly, and being like, "Oh, your views are wrong. They suck. You suck." You know, and it's interesting. It's kind of a feedback loop in that sense, because in that case, you're kind of seeing, people are saying, "Oh, you suck," and then they're gonna be like, "Well, I don't suck. You suck." And um, that's actually uh, like the idea of uh, kind of, if you're trying to convince someone, you kind of have to look at the degree of discrepancy in that case. So, someone who is like, oh, I'm trying to think of like a good example of this. But, let's say there's someone who is, a climate change denier or something in Congress. And then there's someone who wants to spend a bunch of money to combat climate change. There's a little bit too high of a degree of discrepancy in that case. And what you see happening is actually that if there's too much of a discrepancy between the two views, that there's no attitude change, and people tend to fall into what's called reactance theory. In reactance theory, the idea is that if you're trying to persuade someone and you're too heavy-handed, then that person is going to become more entrenched in their previous beliefs. So like, things like shaming or name calling or that kind of stuff, it just doesn't work. It's also been shown with things like censorship, where, let's say the US government says, "Oh, you can't read this book, it's banned." People are going to be more likely to say, "Oh, well, there's obviously something good. They don't want us to see what's in there, so we got to go see it." It makes people even more likely to go and see that, like try and see that book and go to more lengths to go see it.
It's pretty much just college all over again.
Yeah, pretty much. It's real interesting stuff.
Do you think that's this reactionary theory, which makes perfect sense? Like I said, college, people want to party more, drink more because they weren't allowed to when they were younger. Do you think that's partially tied to emotions, this identity and these reactions people have? Because it sounds like what you're saying is that we're not getting too much farther right and left, but we're more convicted. Are we more convicted because we're so much better at understanding our group's policy? Or are we so much more convicted because we now have a new level of emotional attachment to these beliefs for some reason or another?
I feel like there's a little bit of more of a both in that sense. I do believe that in the kind of the social media age, people are a lot better at kind of understanding the different positions, because all they have to do is just look it up on Google or see someone talking about it on Twitter. But I think that there's also an emotional aspect of it, and especially in things that are not necessarily 100% like, I think, like, let's say that they're not personally relevant to us, then we're more likely to take a kind of more emotional kind kind of route of persuasion, which this idea is called the elaboration likelihood model. And basically, the idea is that there's two different routes of persuasion. So you can go the central route, which is, it's facts-based, and people are more likely to use that whenever something is personally relevant. Or there's the peripheral route, which is more based off of superficial characteristics, such as like who's saying the message or how emotionally they're saying it. And it's more likely to be used whenever the message isn't quite as personally relevant. But the thing is that you can kind of make people believe that things are personally relevant to them by using emotions. So if something, say, maybe originally someone doesn't believe that something was personally relevant to them before, if you kind of play with their emotions, it kind of can be used as a little bit of a, I don't want to say like a crutch, but like a shortcut, I guess, like a heuristic. And in that case, people are a lot more likely to be persuaded by the emotional messages. And a lot of times there's research that shows that, and I think we see this in medias too, that fear is a very good motivating factor, a good emotion to play off of. In the past, the research was kind of saying that, you don't want to use too much fear or else people will just kind of shut off and not want to listen to the message at all. But recent studies have actually shown that it doesn't matter how scary it is. It just needs to be scary enough. So you can go like 100% like full scare factor and use that. But the thing is that it's not going to work as a tactic of persuasion unless you provide a specific remedy for this. So in this case, you say, well, let's use the case of like a Fox News or something that's saying, oh, well, illegal immigrants are coming in, they're taking our jobs, they're destroying our livelihood, they're killing and destroying our cities. And then people are like, oh, well, shit, like, I didn't know this. This is crazy, this is scary. And then what they have to do is they go on, they say, well, this is how we stop it. We just completely build a wall. We don't let any immigrants in. And then people are going to say, you know what? Hey, yeah, that would stop it. And for right or wrong, that's a lot of how like media companies or political parties are able to persuade the people, is to kind of effectively use that emotional tactic. And I think that also makes people more convicted in their beliefs.
So what's more important then, if you can even answer this, truth or emotion?
That is a good question. I believe there's a little bit of both, I think it's not really like I guess I'm taking a centrist position here, but in this case, I believe, you need to look at the facts. It's important. But kind of also you need to look at things with a little bit of empathy for other people, and really just, you need to know the personal relevance in your own life. It's kind of a emotional stance there, but thinking of it as an emotion or as a personally relevant part of your life, that's going to make you more likely to look at the facts.
So let me add a second part to that question then. Which is more persuasive, truth or emotion?
It kind of depends, actually, and you're going to get that answer from me a lot, because in psychology everything depends on everything. Psychology is a very new science, and so there's a lot of, I guess, in terms like if you're comparing it to like a chemistry or biology, there's a lot of like quote unquote non-answers, but it really does depend. So again, like I said, persuasion, going back to the elaboration likelihood model, persuasion is more likely to be facts-based if it is personally relevant to you. So let's say, for example, let's say that you're going to be a junior next year, right, in college?
Correct.
So that means you're graduating 2023. So let's say, for example, I'm graduating 2022. Let's say we're going to this new college, or we're going to the same college, and they're going to implement a new test to like a graduation test, basically. It's a cumulative test on every single subject you've ever taken in college ever. But they're going to implement that after the class of 2022 graduates. And so they're going to use, more superficial characteristics in kind of persuading the audience to say that, hey, this is a good thing. They're going to, get a charismatic speaker. He's going to speak to the emotions of the people. He's going to make his speech a lot longer, make a lot more points, regardless of how strong those points are. And for someone like me, that'll persuade me because it doesn't matter to me. I'm not going to have to take it. But to you, you're going to say, hey, wait a minute, these are terrible points. Or like, I don't care. Like, what are the facts about this? So you're going to be more likely to take the central route, whereas I'd be more likely to take the peripheral route.
So it really is audience centered, and you hear that a lot in communication classes. For example, communication is audience focused. It doesn't matter how good of a speaker you are, if the person you're talking to doesn't understand you or doesn't relate to you or whatever else, your communication failed in one sense. So in this same way, that's what's happening here.
Yeah, most definitely.
So I want to ask you one final question, Jeff, and this is something I would like to do for all the podcasts hereafter with any guests, and we'll see how it goes. You can be the first one to answer. You can set the pace. No pressure. What is one thing that you would change about the world right now if you had the ability to change anything?
Shoot, that is a big question. Big question. Probably, I guess. Uh, I guess just more equality and equity in the world is really important. Uh, and that goes for kind of all things, race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, even political party, you could say. Um, and there are ways to kind of decrease the prejudice and decrease all this stuff, but it's kind of a matter of, are people willing to work to get this done? I can kind of leave off with the 6 ways to decrease prejudice, and kind of here's a little bit of a story / research experiment. I love bringing up those. So this actually happened right in our home state of Oklahoma. If you're familiar with Robbers Cave at all, there's a pretty famous experiment where they had this boys' camp, and they split the camp up into 2 different groups. These groups didn't have any contact with each other before, and they didn't even know that the other group existed for a while. They were divided up into the Rattlers and the Eagles. And once they got there, they were told about the other group, and they were told to do these competitive tasks. They're going to compete with the other team for the remainder of the camp. And what happened was that basically the whole thing devolved into like all-out warfare. They were throwing stink bombs in the cabins. They were, calling each other names. They were getting into fist fights. All this stuff was happening. And so that can kind of be likened to a lot of the kind of discrimination and all the isms that are out there that are kind of and the phobias that are really discriminating against different groups. And so what they found was the best way to fix this was actually, because there was kind of a theory before that was called contact hypothesis, which is basically that all you had to do is just increase contact between the two groups and that would reduce prejudice. And it does, but not really enough. And in this case, all that having increased contact did was just allow for more jeers and taunts and attacks toward the other group, even in non-competitive activities like watching a movie or something. And what they found was collaboration was actually a really good way to do this. So they had them do collaborative activities with each other. I believe they said that the bus broke down and they had to help get the bus to a certain location or something. Know how to push together, and that actually decreased the prejudice and hostility. So further research kind of found that the best ways to decrease prejudice is mutual interdependence, a common goal, equal status of group members, having informal interpersonal contact, having multiple contacts with several members of the outgroup, and have social norms in place to promote the equality. So if the whole world could kind of jump on board with kind of implementing these 6 things worldwide, I think that there would be a lot, I think this would be a lot better world.
Well, Jeff, once again, it was an honor for me to have you on this podcast. Like I said, the first guest. Thank you very much for coming on, and I look forward to speaking with you more in the future. You clearly have a lot to say. You've done your research, and you're going to be a psychologist here soon, I'm sure. So really, I appreciate the time sitting down with you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure being on. And yeah, I hope to talk to you again sometime on this. Sorry for being a little long-winded, but I just had a few points to get out and wanted to make sure got my point across. But yeah, again, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.